Master Wardens, Lord Mayor, Your Excellencies, my Lords, Sheriff, Alderman, Chief Commoner, ladies and gentlemen. Can I say what an honour it is to be asked to join this Girl Power evening and give the Tacitus Lecture, and particularly on what is becoming very much a key issue of the moment. Energy issues have been widely reported this week. For example, it started off with the Cabinet meeting in Aberdeen discussing energy. Energy is now part of the Scottish referendum question, and the argument of the 1970s about who owns North Sea oil seems to be back on the table. On Tuesday, a report set out how much more oil and gas we can expect to be able to extract from what we own in the North Sea. Yesterday, the regulator, Ofgem, stepped into the competition debate. Energy questions took place on the floor of the House of Commons today. I await with some trepidation about what tomorrow will bring. The part of the energy industry, though, and the energy story, which I'm proposing to discuss with you tonight, is about electricity generation and the supply of that electricity and the supply of gas to our businesses and to our homes. That is the business of the 80 or so members of Energy UK. Now, when you came in to this event this evening, you expected to see the lights on. You expected to feel warm. But I wonder how many of you actually wondered where the electricity that powers this building and the 3.5 million homes and businesses in the capital city comes from. Energy in all its forms we live with as part of our daily lives, as something that will always be there, and seldom do we consider it much more than that until we get the bill and we have to pay for it. And then we complain, which is why energy is an issue that is both near the top of the political agenda, but is quite such a high-octane one as well. Now, the industry has four main problems. The first is that it is big at a time when to be big is somehow something to be attacked. The second is that it is necessary and it makes a profit when profits and paying dividends to shareholders are now frequently questioned. Third, a variety of subsidies and supports are required in order to enact the policy of these last few years and for the decade or more to come. And fourth, it is in the spotlight, partly because of some poor practices, partly because of opacity, partly because the energy policy and the people are not on the same page, and mostly it's that bill. Bills have gone up. Yet this sector plays a vital role in the UK economy. It is an instrument for growth. It powers the UK. In 2012, which is the last year for which we have the full figures, its contribution to the economic value of this country through both its direct and indirect activities was about £102 billion, making energy one of the biggest industrial contributors we have. It provides employment for more than 650,000 highly skilled people, which means that in every road or street in this country, on average, there are 3 households where somebody is working in the energy sector. It takes on more apprentices than most, and it pays its taxes. This performance in economic terms and in job growth underscores the critical role that the sector plays for the UK and in powering this country's continuing recovery. Now, if I dare say to an audience where many of you will be from the city and financial services industry, unlike other prominent sectors such as that, the energy industry provides jobs predominantly outside the southeast, and in so doing supports the regions hit hardest by the recessions of the last few years. But if that is a difference to the financial services industry, the similarity is that energy is one which is not liked, subject to significant political involvement and legislative and regulatory change. And as I know only too well from a previous role, it is not possible to get out of the political spotlight without grief, without change, and without substantial cost. So let me look back for a moment in order to set the context for this Tacitus Lecture, which asks the question, is energy just another power game? In simple terms, a power game it is, and in both senses of the phrase. But to look back for a moment, gas and electricity were both part of the privatization processes of the 1980s and 1990s. Then we had plenty of gas. The UK, in fact, was an exporter. At that time, electricity was generated principally from coal-fired power stations, some of which had been around for many years, and from the nuclear power stations. We also had surplus capacity. Initially, the post-privatization and pre-privatization worlds looked in some respects very similar, but with many millions of people now holding shares in their local energy companies. In private ownership, though, the industry could invest outside the shackles of government, and a dash for gas resulted, which meant that new and efficient combined cycle gas turbine generators were built. It also, though, looked upwards and it looked outwards, and advised by investment bankers, it undertook mergers, acquisitions, demergers, and it restructured, some for logical reasons and some for less logical reasons. Our houses may have been badly insulated, but they seemed warm enough, and we wore jerseys indoors 20 years ago. The cost of heating did not appear such a big issue. The lights were on. Governments came and governments went, of all political varieties and types. Nuclear got into a mess, it was sorted out, a hiatus occurred, everything was resolved. The power generating industry rationalized, and a number of large companies were formed who both generated electricity and supplied it. And many of the small shareholders who'd taken that stake now took the cash. National Grid assumed ownership and control of the transmission system, and a variety of independent companies emerged owning the networks that connect the grid to homes and businesses. Then, in early 2000s, the first of several reviews commenced centering around the climate change debate. That review asked the questions that we are trying to answer today. What does a low carbon economy look like? How can we achieve it? Can carbon capture and storage come out of the laboratory and into the mainstream to reduce the carbon footprint, predominantly of the coal-fired power stations and some of our heavy industrial sectors? And was there a future for nuclear? If so, what was it? Another review took place in 2006, and there the concerns started to harden. Concerns on the dependence of oil and gas, concerns about carbon emissions, and it proposed putting the UK on a path to cut carbon dioxide emissions by 80% by 2050 compared with 1990. At the same time, in 2006, it emphasized maintenance of reliable energy supplies, promoting competitive markets, making sure that every home was adequately and affordably heated. It highlighted clean energy. The renewables obligation came into being on the back of that, promoting particularly wind and community-based systems such as combined heat and power. And putting a price on carbon was proposed, with the intention of executing this through a European-wide arrangement. That 06 review became the 07 White Paper and the Climate Change Act of 08. That put in the framework to achieve that 80% mandatory cut. It put in place other things as well. In fact, the UK became the first country in the world to set such a long-range and significant carbon reduction target into law, and also the first country to create such a legally binding framework. And as part of the legislative process, we imported into the UK the requirement of the EU for Europe to produce 20% of energy from renewables by 2020, which for us in the UK means 15% of energy from renewables. And alongside that sits 2 directives to reduce emissions. But during this same period, during the period when all this was being discussed, reviews were coming forward, and acts were being put together, the UK turned from being an exporter of gas to being an importer in 2004. By 2010, the world price of gas had doubled, and the UK and Europe were struggling with the aftermath of the biggest financial crisis for more than 100 years. The arena had altered significantly. Now, climate change has not just been around for a few years. It's been with us for centuries. A look through the pictures hanging in the many galleries of London show long-skirted ladies and men in top hats skating on a frozen Thames. It's not frozen today. Meanwhile, go back a little further, and in Roman times there were vineyards in York. I come from Yorkshire. Yorkshire is a bit chilly. So climate cycles happen, and the question this time is not is it happening, but rather the degree to which the population and just our economic activity has aggressively added to the normal climate cycle. Harsher winters, colder summers, droughts in countries not expecting them, heat waves in the US and Australia, floods this winter in Britain have all ensured that climate change issues remain of public concern, of business concern, and of ongoing political concern. But in the debate on the Climate Change Act of 2008, much of that which should have been discussed fully was not raised properly, and to this day, some of these issues still do not get the discussion that they warrant. What should have been raised in that debate as well were the economic costs in the wider and narrower sense, what it actually means to meet the targets. Practicality and pragmatism appeared absent, and as a result, that proper discussion with the British people on what it was that we were actually doing and how we needed to do it, what it meant to each and every one of us, both in respect of where we lived and also in respect of our energy bill, did not flow out from the debate of that time, and to this day is still largely absent. And although the vote then highlighted the huge importance of climate change, on the other hand, I'm always reminded of something that was attributed, whether rightly or wrongly, I do not know, but something that is attributed to two great parliamentarians of almost totally opposite views, Enoch Powell and Tony Benn. It was said that one of the very few things about which they agreed was when the House of Commons passed legislation with total cross-party agreement, it would inevitably go wrong. I worry. Let me hasten to add here, I do not believe that the climate change agenda is wrong, nor do I believe that cleaning up emissions and moving to a low-carbon future is wrong either. I think, though, that the debate at that time did not get into the issues, it did not get into the practicalities, and those practicalities are essential when considering what is, in fact, a mainstream economic policy. Its implementation is important to us all. And so to today. Today, we are left with what is often referred to as the energy trilemma. That is, meeting the decarbonisation targets for 2020 and beyond, providing energy security so that when people come home, they can switch on their lights and their heating, and thirdly, all at an affordable price. Considering that right now, both householders and businesses are concerned about their energy bill, and that the further investment needed to meet the low carbon generation target requires an estimated £100 billion or more, and that this passes through, like any investment, onto the customer's bill, can the trilemma be solved? How is this trilemma solved? Or maybe we should turn it into a different form of words and call it who pays, how much, and for what. Energy requires an open and honest debate with the people. It needs to have that open and honest debate led by the policymakers. It should not be a who is to blame game. I'm now going to set out my next set of remarks, firstly on generation, where we are, where we're going, and secondly on the supply side. What does it mean for us? what does it mean for customers? And then I'm going to link them together. Let me go back to those climate change targets. The UK climate change targets of reducing emissions by 80% by 2050 and producing 15% of our energy from renewable sources by that date. Sorry, 15% of our energy from renewable sources by 2020. These are economy targets, but these economy targets have been predominantly placed on the energy industry to deliver. Yet energy covers a number of things. It doesn't just cover electricity, it also covers gas central heating, for example. So the overwhelming majority of this target, related both to carbon reduction and to renewables, that this country seeks to meet, and our pan-economy targets, are not in fact placed on the economy. They're not actually even placed on the energy industry. They're placed on one sector of the energy industry, and that is on power generation. And that's why what seemed a reasonable renewable target of 15% translates as 30% of the UK electricity has got to be produced from renewables by 2020. A long way to go from a near standing start. And at the same time, two directives about emissions, one in place at the moment and another to impact from the 1st of January 2016, their implementation means the steady closure of the coal power stations that are not converted to biomass. So we have some issues to address. The economics of meeting these targets from power generation are complex. Renewables, predominantly wind, both on and offshore, and biomass have high capital costs. And in the case of wind, low running costs, but all need support or subsidies if they're to be built. And this support is being paid for by the customer. Small-scale schemes are great. Solar panels on a house, which gets a feed-in tariff, which is attractive for the homeowner to do it. It's a good idea. The cost of that is socialized onto customers' bills. The larger scale schemes require suppliers to purchase power generated by renewables via something called the renewables obligation. That again passes directly through to customer bills. And the electricity market reform proposals legislated for last year provide a new financial instrument, a contract for difference, to subsidize low carbon generation. The first CFD has been awarded for new nuclear at Hinkley. That will come into being, be delivered in the mid-2020s. The CFD means that the low-carbon generator is guaranteed a price for its output, which is essential to give the investors the return they require. The difference between the wholesale price and that CFD price is paid for by the customer, and it's another levy on the bill. So if I bring this together a bit and put a little more figures to it all, the total amount of support for low carbon in this current year is expected to be about 3.9 billion, rising to 7.6 billion pounds by 2020. And if I add it all up together, that means just under 40 billion pounds of support in the 6 years from now to 2020. It's a lot of money. If I put the costs another way, today the wholesale price for electricity, which I looked at earlier this morning, was about £52 per megawatt hour. Renewables come in at a considerably higher price than that, and that's why you need the support. And on the back of that is the refurbishment and the upgrading of the electricity networks. And on the back of that as well is that renewable power is intermittent. On average, National Grid estimates that wind, for example, is available for between 30 and 40% of the time, so backup is required as well. Backup that is flexible, backup that's able to start and stop quickly. That extra capacity needed is most likely to be predominantly gas. But gas, at that current wholesale price of £52 per megawatt hour, is also having difficulty economically, and to such an extent that we're now mothballing a number of gas generators. There are, however, planning for 23 gigawatts of new gas generation, about a third of the total capacity the UK needs. But most of this pipeline has either been suspended or is on hold, with only one plant proceeding. That 23 gigawatts would do nicely for replacing the coal and providing the backup required. If we are to get that to come forward, the economics have to be right, and so gas needs a payment too to provide the extra capacity needed by a mechanism that has been devised, that has been legislated for, but has not yet been implemented. It is a complex story, and there's two more pieces to add to the mix. The US shale revolution is the first. In his acceptance speech following his election for the second term, Obama said the US will no longer be dependent on foreign imports. That shows, I believe, the extent of the US shale revolution, providing both gas and oil, with the result that electricity prices have fallen like a stone. At the same time, by replacing its coal by its cheap gas, the US has also met its emission targets, and another consequence is there's now a glut of cheap coal in the world, and so coal power stations are providing and producing the cheapest electricity. My second factor is the emissions trading system I mentioned earlier, supposed to give a carbon price to help provide a cost-effective route for low-carbon generation. As sadly one has come to expect, it has ended up in a tangle and a muddle and a confusion and an argument between countries. The carbon price as measured by that trading scheme has collapsed. To provide certainty, the UK put in place its own carbon price, the carbon price floor. It's now significantly higher than that of the EU and rising. So here in the UK, we have a rising carbon price to be paid for, predominantly by the coal power stations, in recognition that they pollute. But that price is considerably higher than that being paid elsewhere in Europe. Electricity prices are significantly greater than they are in the US as a result of shale gas, and the intensive electricity users are now raising competitive concerns about it all. This complex jigsaw I will try and draw together. On the one side, we have renewables being built. The subsidies are in place. New nuclear has been agreed. The electricity market reform legislation is now law. The contract for different process has been agreed. The capacity mechanism is in train. Some biomass conversion is taking place. It looks like we will meet our 2020 targets. On the other side, coal-fired power stations, still providing 40% of our power, are closing faster than expected. Gas is not coming forward in the amounts that are required. Subsidies are significant and customers are complaining about their bills. The outgoing chief executive of the regulator and indeed of the CEO of National Grid and others have highlighted the narrowing surplus capacity and the increasing risk of a credit crunch. A big unknown is state aid approval. That sits in here too. And I appreciate that I've taken some time to explain this generation complexity. I appreciate that it does not easily fit into a 20-second soundbite or a 10-sentence article. This power game, though, is getting more dangerous. The sums of money are large, the risks are increasing, and that's why we have to have that open and honest debate. Policymakers need to explain their policy to the people and get the buy-in. I turn next to supply. Now, energy suppliers who sell you the gas and electricity are not exactly the most popular part of the industry, to say the least. They're vying for the place at the bottom of the ladder with journalists, politicians, estate agents. We're still ahead, though, of second-hand car salesmen and well ahead of those blokes on the tube with the backpacks that they stick in your face. But on supply, I will start with competition and oft-repeated myths. The three oft-repeated myths are: everybody knows that there's very little competition in the supply market. The second one, everyone knows that there are just 6 companies only and they're keeping everyone else out. And the third, everyone knows that these companies are making big profits. Are we really sure that's correct? I'm a great believer in facts. I appreciate that they're boring and dull, and they're also sometimes inconvenient. But facts are essential, and I'm going to look at the facts. There are about 40 independent generating companies and around 20 independent supply companies. In this context, independent means not just those 6 largest ones. A third of all the generator capacity, actually, we've got is independent. 25% of all the electricity bought by business is from those independent generators, and nearly 3/4 of gas purchased by business is from independent suppliers. This looks to me, and indeed to many others, as a lot of choice and a lot of competition, both in electricity and gas supply for the business community. In domestic, I grant you, it's different. Independent suppliers are now only just starting to get into the market, although we've got 20. Households are also switching to them. I keep being told, in fact, I was told when I arrived in the energy industry, that people don't switch, that switching is low. Well, the switching rate's actually pretty steady at around 250,000 households a month, more than doubling at times when either there's a tariff increase or a scary story on the front page of the newspaper. So if I look at perhaps November and December, when both happened last year, about 1 million households switched. The run rate for switching is between 3 and 4 million households a year. It is very difficult to equate 3 or 4 million households switching with the word low. Many more energy suppliers are bringing choice into the market. Customers are taking that choice, and that is good. And just as independence transformed the business market, they'll do the same in the domestic market as well. Even now, the analysts are saying that the domestic energy retail market is more competitive than it has ever been. The substantial growth of the independent suppliers, although still small, is driving competitive pricing. As a result, the big companies are taking notice of the small ones. They're reacting with new tariffs and innovations which may well not have taken place otherwise. The influence of independent suppliers already extends significantly beyond the customers that they directly supply. In this area, as in many others, competition works. The actions that result from competition are beneficial to us all. So let me get to the bit about big profits. Well, there has actually been quite a lot of misinformation about supplier profits and charges. At one end, there's the use of some accounts that have provided the regulator for a way in which they were never intended, such as calling earnings before interest, before tax, before depreciation, before amortization as profit. That actually isn't the case. A financial audience, such as many of you will be here this evening, know that one as well. At the other end, what really is actually happening is the energy companies make at or around £50 per customer a year. That's £1 per household per week. It doesn't look like a big or an excessive profit, and especially weighed up against the large sums that need to be spent on the investment. And even the more schizophrenic is that proposal for a price freeze. A typical energy bill is composed of several elements, of which a number are outside the control of the supplier. As the analysts have all clearly stated, the only way to avoid a massive problem is for big increases before the freeze and big increases after, but even then we will lose some of the small suppliers who've brought such good competition into this area. The mantra behind the price freeze says that at the end of it, the wholesale market will have been restructured, generation will have been separated for supply, and therefore all will be okay. That mantra is disingenuous. There are always points and there are always actions that can be made to improve the operation of markets. But it is difficult, if not impossible, to see how the outcome of such a restructuring could possibly meet the expectation. So it is hardly surprising that the energy companies, be they large or small, integrated or independent, an incumbent or a new challenger, it is hardly surprising that they all welcome the government proposal for the authorities to undertake a competition assessment that is due to be produced in early April. An aura of allegation and counterclaim, of misinformation, of confusion, and of inaccurate assertion in these areas and elsewhere serves neither the industry well, its customers well, nor indeed does it serve the UK well. We may be used to aggressive debates on issues played out in the public domain in this country. However, the investors, many are from overseas. That £100+ billion of investment required means that we here compete for it both with other countries and with other utilities. The hostility of the debate here is not an attractive one for those international investors. So let me use my last few moments by saying what I think needs to be done. Firstly, by the industry. The industry needs to take some of these domestic supply issues off the table. It needs to take action to reduce the continuous stream of negative commentary and of customer concern. Some actions are simple. Clearer bills. What does your bill mean? Speeding up switching, making switching more secure, solving the direct debit questions as they come, bringing in simpler tariffs, ensuring that it's easier for people to compare tariffs and get the right one for them. It's insulating homes, it's even answering the phones and responding to complaints. That list is not intended to be complete. Rather, it sets out what is underway. And weekly, politicians, regulators, MPs, the papers come up with more. It's easy to lose trust, it's hard to regain it. It will be a long period of doing the right thing before the changes that are currently underway are properly recognised and that the intention of the companies to make those and more changes is fully recognised. Research shows that the industry is not believed, but do these things the industry must do, it will do, and it will do them well. That price freeze I touched on has also touched a well of concern and must not and should not be ignored. What else? Well, a much more compelling case is required for a rather boring subject, and that is for customers of all types to conserve energy, to insulate homes better, to manage demand. Smart meters are on the way. That will help. It'll make saving energy visual. I appreciate that it's not sexy. I appreciate that if you go into the pub on a Saturday night and say, I'm going to talk about my insulation, you may very quickly have no friends. But it doesn't make it a wrong thing to do. It will make it warmer, and it will help you with your bills. And on the generation side, as long as the necessary support is there for the low-carbon technologies, we will build our plants, replace old nuclear with new, install the wind farms on and offshore, and build the backup required. All is possible, but there are provisos. Timetables need to be sensible, and the programme explained, including the recognition that, as with any other industry, investment in generation will feed through to what the customer will pay. This is a major industrial and economic policy. To have a policy, though, that requires that major investment to bring it about, but then criticises the companies for the consequence because it adds on the bill, is like ordering champagne and then blaming the waiter when you've got to pay for it. I worry that expectations are being raised that cannot be delivered. The ultimate risk is energy security that is rightly considered to be a fundamental requirement of our economy and a right for and by the British people. Energy, power, is being fought over from the perspective of policy. It's being fought over from the perspective of price. It has been fought over from the perspective of what should or should not be built. It's being fought over from the perspective of security supply, and it may well play a significant part in the fight of the 2015 general election. This is a political game, and it's a power game about which we should all be concerned. I say again that the trilemma of decarbonisation, security of supply and affordability is who pays how much and for what. The right end game does not need more legislation, more regulation or more policy. It needs decisions on priorities and that open and honest debate. Thank you.